Hi, I'm Rachel, and I'm here to do some quick reviews of three of the books up for the Sami Rohr Prize of 2019. The Sami Rohr Prize is awarded annually to emerging Jewish writers in fiction or nonfiction, depending on the year, with odd years being fiction years. And for the last couple of years, I've been reviewing the backlist titles, and I'm finally on track with the present. Except that I'm not really, because this award was announced a couple of months ago. In fact, I did a whole video shortly before that announcement talking about the books that were nominated. There were 5 in total, but I just make it a practice to read and review 3. And actually, now it's been a while since I've read each of the 3 books on my list. I'm going to just blame other, reading and booktube videos and all of that. But I have my Goodreads reviews, which are also linked down below, and my memories of the books, so I'll just give you some brief recaps about what they're about. So the book I read the longest time ago, about a year ago now, is my least favorite of the 3, although it won the Choice Award, which is basically second place. It is The Worlds We Think We Know, a collection of short stories by Dalia Rosenfeld. What I particularly didn't like about the collection is that the stories felt more like sketches or vignettes and not fully formed, and more of a surreal cast overall rather than realist fiction, which really is my personal jam. I also like longer stories with more meat on the bones. Although looking back on my Goodreads reviews, there were a few stories that stuck out to me as good ones, and I'll list off a few that have stayed in my memory. I liked Flight, where a girl asks a friend to teach her a complicated piano piece to impress another guy. Also Amnon, where a woman feels trapped between her Israeli boyfriend and her desire to return to America. And Daughters of Respectable Houses, where a shut-in is able to form a quick relationship with her husband's boss's wife over books. And Vignette of the North, where a vegetable seller and a neurotic painter are in a tense relationship. The one that sticks most in my head is a stream of consciousness story called Bagaborg Remembers. I thought she actually did that rather well, and it's about a New York professor who's robbed and is trying to remember all of the details of that, quick altercation. But what I like particularly is how remembrances aren't so concrete, and your mind keeps jumping over to other things that are going on in your life, like in this scene. This is some of what he hoped to record. From the back he approached. The back! First the hand at my neck, all 5 fingers, the thumbnail in need of filing. The face then, twisting around like a jack-in-the-box to meet my own, white, not black, eyes deep in discussion. In lieu of a command, a knife at my Adam's apple, holding it in place. How I ached to swallow. A drunk walked toward us and disappeared into an alley, presumably to relieve himself. To relieve himself of me? I dropped my briefcase onto my foot. My assailant impatiently kicked it into the street. When I saw that he did not value what was inside, I valued it twofold. Lecture notes, a French-English dictionary, 3 ballpoint pens. My attacker's hands did not tremble. This disappointed me. Instinctively, I held my arms up above my head. Just as instinctively, he forced them down. When I tried to stand up straight, he pushed me against the shop window. When I told him that my wallet was in my right pocket, he reached for the left one. He pulled the wallet from my pocket, and I remembered Angelica. At home, poring over the wallet's contents, he would find Angelica's picture and stop to catch his breath. Angelica rushing at him with her icy eyes, blouse half-buttoned, raven hair tied like a tourniquet around the top of her head. Would he not reach out for Angelica then, try to lift her from the picture onto his lap? Would he not recall the heat below my hairline, and try to transfer it to the woman who had thrown herself out of my house, the same way he had thrown me to the ground? The violation of a mugging, of his hand at my neck, of his dagger at my throat. I was neither a friend nor an enemy to him. It was all for Angelica. So that's pretty much what sticks with me the most, but overall, this collection didn't really stick with me. I'm going to jump to the last book I read, which was a couple of months ago, and this one is the winner of the Sami Rohr Prize. This is The Last Watchman of Old Cairo by Michael David Lucas. This is a novel that takes place in Cairo in 3 time periods. There's an ancient first century time period where a young Muslim boy is asked by the Jewish community to guard their new synagogue after some skirmishes happen in that area. Then, in the late 19th century, when Egypt is under English control, these Protestant sisters and historians and treasure collectors, as it were, these two twins, Agnes and Margaret, who are going to the Geniza of the synagogue, which is where they store all paperwork with the name of God, and they're looking for a special scroll of historical significance. And finally, in near modern day, the son of the last Watchman of Old Cairo is living in Los Angeles, and when his father dies, he's called to Cairo to sort of solve a mystery of his father's life. Although ultimately I don't think that mystery is all that important. It's really just about reconnecting him with the past. And the Ezra scroll does filter in and out of all of the stories. In the first story is the most fantastical, where people believe in magic the most. And Ali, the young Muslim boy, gets entangled with a Jewish sorcerer, in large part because he develops a crush on one of the Jewish girls of the synagogue, and he tries to get an amulet to make her love him back, and I think the story kind of peters out in terms of the spell that doesn't really go anywhere, and the magician who's swiftly dispatched. Especially since this is a multi-generational story, I guess I was kind of expecting, a spell to go into place that would affect the rest of the generations. Especially since there did seem to be troubles in the generations that we saw, both in Agnes and Margaret's time, and then of course with the estranged son and his father in the modern day. The son, by the way, is actually half Jewish and half Muslim, and his father did in fact marry a girl from the synagogue, and then she had to leave Cairo along with many of the Egyptian Jews. Agnes and Margaret are never really able to find the Ezra scroll, although they get embroiled in a plot of trying to save other documents from some nefarious fellows who are attempting to sell them on the black market. And then in the final section, it's kind of left up to mystery whether or not our protagonist, whose name is Joseph, comes into contact with the Ezra scroll. In a section that really moved me just on a esoteric level, talking about the narration of the Jewish people and the Jewish story. I should mention that in our present storyline, the synagogue is basically a relic. There's no more Jews left to worship in it, although it has a long and storied history. And so we pass, Rabbi Sada said, each generation building on those who came before. We can climb the mountain. If we're lucky, we might catch a glimpse of the promised land. But we must rely on the next generation to continue our journey. It was always just out of reach, the promised land, always over that next rise. Still, the wandering continued, generation after generation. The same stories were repeated year after year, and always with the same hope that the end of the journey was close at hand. After so many years of wandering, there had to be something at the end. Unless, of course, the wandering was the story, an end unto itself. In which case, there was only the desert, an infinite scroll of sand fixed at the far distance with the hope of an oasis. And in 200 or 300 years, the synagogues of San Francisco and New York would look no different from this one. Dusky husks of grandeur one might stop in to visit on the way to the Golden Gate Bridge or the Statue of Liberty. It was a strangely comforting thought that a few centuries from now, a group of Jews would be telling these same stories in Bangkok or Kolkata, believing once more that they had found their safe harbor, that their long journey had finally come to an end. You hold it like a baby, Mr. Mosseri said, as he handed me the Torah scroll. I had never held a baby before, but I understood the basic idea, cradle the head and support the body. Closing my eyes, I swayed with the beat, felt the steady pulse of the scroll in its warmth, like a stone that's been in the sun all day. There were only 3 in the circle, but beyond them I could sense the presence of those who had come before us, whose lives revolved around this place, those who prayed in the synagogue and those who watched over it. After a few songs, we sat down again and Mr. Mosseri took the scroll inside. The pews were gleaming like a movie set, like a postcard from a dream. The light bent as I watched Mr. Mosseri climb the stairs to the women's section. He disappeared behind a copse of pillars. Then he was halfway up the ladder to the attic, still cradling the scroll like a baby. It was only then that I considered what was that I had been holding. Only in its absence could I really feel that tingling sensation, like a distant hum of electricity. Looking from Rabbi Saada to Khalid and back again, I tried to formulate a question about the scroll, about my father, about the fragment I was looking for, about the documents in Cambridge. Was that? Before I could complete the thought, Mr. Mosseri emerged empty-handed, and I swallowed back the final words of the sentence. This was a very compelling read, and I particularly liked how Lucas was able to make each section sound very different from the others. But ultimately, I really feel like the weakness here was that it was too short, that there just wasn't enough time to spend with these people in, less than 300 pages? There was just no way that this could stand up to my favorite of the three reads. So my favorite of the Sami Rohr contenders, despite not winning any awards, is my favorite book I've read so far of 2019. It is The Weight of Ink by Rachel Kadish. Kadish talks about the impetus of this work being that she wanted to answer the question that Virginia Woolf posed in A Room of One's Own, about what it would be like if a woman from Shakespeare's time dared to be a scholar. And she found a specific set of circumstances where a Jewish woman would be able to be a scribe, in secret, of course, in the 17th century in England. So this novel also follows multiple storylines, and in the modern-day storyline, we have some historians who actually find these new old documents in a house that's being renovated. And it turns out through their research that they've found the work of a brand new scribe, and they're even able to discern that she is a woman. And then we, as the readers, go back to the 17th century and trace the story of Esther Velázquez. She, like many of the Jews in the 17th century in England, are actually refugees, as it were, from Portugal by way of Amsterdam. There's a lot of moving around, in large part because of the Inquisition, where the Catholic Church often tortured Jews. And Esther and her brother are living with a rabbi who had been blinded by the Inquisition. They come to England once England officially opens their doors again to Jews, and the rabbi, at behest of his community in Amsterdam, is trying to start up learning again for the community of newcomers and those who had been secret Jews in hiding. And so we get a lavish picture of life, Jewish in general, in the 17th century. And we also get a very complete picture of life for our characters in the 21st century of aging historian Helen Watt and what brought her as a non-Jew to want to study 17th century Jewish life in England, and her graduate assistant, American Jewish boy Aaron Levy, who starts out kind of cocky but goes on his own kind of journey. Certainly the most compelling character in all of this is Esther herself, who through scribing for the rabbi is able to formulate a lot of her own thoughts about the world as it is and what she believes in. And she is able to communicate with a lot of learned people, including Baruch Spinoza, who is our most famous of excommunicated Jews, who was excommunicated from the Amsterdam community because he was espousing ideas in lines with atheism. And Esther's, beliefs sort of start to go into that direction as well. But she's also looking for community and a place to belong in her here and now, which is particularly difficult because she doesn't necessarily want to get married. She doesn't have a lot of good choices in that regard. And she wants to be able to keep writing and formulating thoughts, despite the fact that you can only do that secretly as a woman. So there's a whole lot in here about the Jewish experience, and it's particularly heartening to get this 17th century English perspective, which is mostly unknown and untrodden upon ground in historical fiction. Here's just a small taste of that world building. Indeed, a few hours of sobriety seemed more than most of London would willingly endure. So thoroughly had London remade itself since the restoration of the royal court that Esther found it a strain to recall the city that had come before. Now the king and his famed lovers had made an art of raucousness, and it seemed all London followed. Not a food or song or deed or costume was left plain that might somehow be adorned. Torrents of lace and ribboned lovelocks festooned gentlemen everywhere, but among the Puritans and Quakers. Women, young and old, promenaded the city under the weight of expensive and brightly colored fabrics. Such had been banned under the Puritans. And an overfullness seemed to strain the city's very walls, as though each satiety had to be challenged to see if the body that was London could be made to sustain yet further pleasure. Against this abundance, the synagogue's new Mohammed had swiftly set itself, a bulwark against all it deemed grotesque. With the elegant and austere Rabbi Sasportas, newly imported from abroad, now walking openly in his dark robes and skull cap on London streets, and the wealthier members of the congregation talking of constructing a new and grand synagogue building suitable for such an esteemed rabbi, London's Jewry daily seemed to Esther more and more like Amsterdam's. The small ring of men who'd lately formed the Mohammed spoke up stridently from the men's side of the synagogue, issuing warnings against praying with Tedescos, which are Ashkenazi Jews, these are Sephardi Jews, and against the self-declared Messiah Sabbatai Zevi, and proclaiming new community standards for dress, dance, music, and of course attendance of the theater. Indeed, Constantina's long-ago pronouncements about Amsterdam's Jews now kept Esther jarring company. See how these men of the synagogue set themselves up as judges. It remained true that all had not yet submitted to the community's new rules. A mighty argument was even now in progress, Rivka had reported, because Sasportas had threatened to expel 2 men of the community who refused circumcision. Indeed, many of the synagogue's men and women nodded respectfully to his sermons, and then ran their households as they pleased, and the young winked at the Mohammed's proclamations and then flung themselves at London. Isn't it so rich, like you're just diving into the prose there? Everything was so rich and realized, and despite being almost 600 pages, I almost want to read it again, though I have so much else I need to read as well, but this is just definitely worth it. I'm still surprised that it did not win. It just was a tour de force. Though honestly, I recommend both of these books. So that about covers it for me now. Like I said, you can find my Goodreads reviews for these 3 books below, and I'll also link information about the Sami Rohr Prize. The Jewish Book Council, which helps run the prize, actually revamped their website between last year and this year, so I think a lot of the information on my previous Sami Rohr videos might be dead links by now, but it's a much cleaner site now, so hopefully you'll find all the information you want there. And meanwhile, I will be back, hopefully in a few days, to do Friday Reads, and I have a couple of other videos I'm hoping to end the month with. So stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.